1.2.2 The pistil, megasporangium, ovule and embryo sac. The gynoecium represents the female reproductive part of the flower. The gynoecium may consist of a single pistil monocarpellary or may have more than one pistil multicarpellary. When there are more than one, the pistil may be fused together syncarpus figure 2.7b or may be free apocarpus figure 2.7c. Each pistil has three parts figure 2.7a: the stigma, style and the ovary. The stigma serves as a landing platform for pollen grains. The style is the elongated cylinder part beneath the stigma. The basal bulge part of the pistil is the ovary. Inside the ovary is the ovarian cavity locule. The placenta is located inside the ovarian cavity. Recall the definition and types of placentation that you studied in class 11. Arising from the plant's placenta are the megasporangia, commonly called ovules. The number of ovules in an ovary may be 1, wheat, paddy, mango, to many, papaya, watermelon, orchids. The megasporangium ovule. Let us familiarize ourselves with the structure of a typical angiosperm ovule, figure 2.7d. The ovule is a small structure attached to the placenta by means of a stalk called funicle. The body of the ovule fuses with the funicle in the region called hilum. Thus, hilum represents the junction between ovule and the funicle. Each ovule has one or two protective envelopes called integuments. Integuments encircle the nucellus except at the tip where a small opening called the micropyle is organized. Opposite the micropylar end is the chalaza representing the basal part of the ovule. Enclosed within the integuments is a mass of cells called nucellus. Cells of the nucellus have abundant reserve food materials. Located in the nucellus is the embryo sac or female gametophyte. An ovule generally has a single embryo sac formed from a megaspore. Megasporogenesis. The process of formation of megaspores from the megaspore mother cell is called megasporogenesis. Ovules generally differentiate a single megaspore mother cell (MMC) in the micropylar region of the nucellus. It is a large cell containing dense cytoplasm and a prominent nucleus. The MMC undergoes meiotic division. What is the importance of the MMC undergoing meiosis? Meiosis results in the production of 4 megaspores, figure 2.8a. Female gametophyte. In a majority of flowering plants, one of the megaspore is functional with the other 3 regenerate. Only the functional megaspore develops into the female gametophyte embryo sac. This method of embryo sac formation from a single megaspore is termed monosporic development. What will be the ploidy of the cells of the nucellus, MMC, the functional megaspore and female gametophyte? Let us study formation of the embryo sac in a little more detail. Figure 2.8b. The nucleus of the functional megaspore divides mitotically to form 2 nuclei which move to the opposite poles, forming the 2 nucleate embryo sac. 2 more sequential mitotic nuclear divisions result in the formation of the 4 nucleate and later the 8 nucleate stages of the embryo sac. It is of interest to note that these mitotic divisions are strictly free nuclear. That is, nuclear divisions are not followed immediately by cell wall formation. After the 8 nucleate stage, cell walls are laid down, leading to the organization of the typical female gametophyte or embryo sac. Observe the distribution of cells inside the embryo sac, figure 2.8bc. 6 of the 8 nuclei are surrounded by cell walls and organized into cells. The remaining 2 nuclei, called polar nuclei, are situated below the egg apparatus in the large central cell. There is a characteristic distribution of the cells within the embryo sac. 3 cells are grouped together at the micropylar end and constitute the egg apparatus. The egg apparatus in turn consists of 2 synergids and 1 egg cell. The synergids have a special cellular thickenings at the micropylar tip called filiform apparatus, which play an important role in guiding the pollen tubes into the synergid. 3 cells are at the chalazal end and are called the antipodals. The large central cell, as mentioned earlier, has 2 polar nuclei. The typical angiosperm embryo sac at maturity through 8 nucleate is 7-celled. 1.2.3 Pollination. In the preceding section, you have learned that the male and female gametes in flowering plants are produced in the pollen grain and embryo sac respectively. As both types of gametes are non-motile, they have to be bound together for fertilization to occur. How is this achieved? Pollination is the mechanism to achieve this objective. Transfer of pollen grains set from the anther to the stigma of a pistil is termed pollination. Flowering plants have evolved an amazing array of adaptation to achieve pollination. They make use of external agents to achieve pollination. Can you list the possible external agents? Kinds of pollination. Depending on the source of pollen, pollination can be divided into three types. First, autogamy. In this type, pollination is achieved within the same flower. Transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Figure 2.9a. In a normal flower which opens and exposes the anthers and the stigma, complete autogamy is rather rare. Autogamy in such flowers requires synchrony in pollen release and stigma receptivity, and also the anther and the stigma should lie close to each other so that self-pollination can occur. Some plants such as viola, common pansy, oxalis and commelina produce two types of flowers: chasmogamous flowers, which are similar to flowers of other species with exposed anthers and a stigma, and clistogamous flowers, which do not open at all. Figure 2.9c. In such flowers, the anther and a stigma lie close to each other. When anther dehisce in the flower buds, pollen grains come in contact with the stigma to effect pollination. Thus, clistogamous flowers are invariably autogamous, as there is no chance of cross pollen landing on the stigma. Clistogamous flowers produce assured set even in the absence of pollinators. Do you think that clistogamy is advantageous or disadvantageous to the plant? Why? Second, geotnegamy. Transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another plant of the same plant. Although geotnegamy is functionally cross-pollination involving a pollinating agent, genetically it is similar to autogamy since the pollen grains come from the same plant. Third, genogamy. Transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a different plant. Figure 2.9b. This is the only type of pollination which during pollination bring genetically different types of pollen grains to the stigma. Agents of pollination. Plants use two abiotic wind and water and one biotic animals agents to achieve pollination. Majority of plants use biotic agents for pollination. Only a small proportion of plants use abiotic agents. Pollen grains coming in contact with the stigma is a chance factor in both wind and water pollination. To compensate for this uncertainties and associated loss of pollen grains, the flowers produce enormous amount of pollen when compared to the number of ovules available for pollination. Pollination by wind is more common amongst abiotic pollination. Wind pollination also requires that the pollen grains are light and non-sticky so that they can be transported in wind currents. They often possess well-exposed stamen so that the pollens are easily dispersed into wind current. Figure 2.10. And large, often feathery stigma to easily trap airborne pollen grains. Wind pollinated flowers often have a single ovule in each ovary and numerous flowers packed into an inflorescence. A familiar example is the corn cob. The tassels you see are nothing but the stigma and a style which wave in the wind to the trap pollen grains. Wind pollination is quite common in grasses. Pollination by water is quite rare in flowering plants and is limited to about 30 genera, mostly monocotyledons. As against this, you would recall that water is a regular mode of transport for the male gametes among the lower plant groups such as algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes. It is believed, particularly for some bryophytes and pteridophytes, that their distribution is limited because of the need for water for the transport of male gametes and fertilization. Some examples of water pollinated plants are Vallisneria and Hadrilla, which grow in fresh water, and several marine sea grasses such as Zostera. Not all aquatic plants use water for pollination. In a majority of aquatic plants such as water hyacinth and water lily, the flowers emerge above the level of water and are pollinated by insects or wind, as in most of the land plants. In Vallisneria, the female flower reaches the surface of water by the long stalk, and male flowers or pollen grains are released onto the surface of water. They are carried passively by water currents. Figure 2.11a. Some of them eventually reach the female flowers and the stigma. In another group of water pollinated plants such as sea grasses, female flowers remain submerged in water and the pollen grains are released inside the water. Pollen grains in many such species are long, ribbon-like, and they are carried passively inside the water. Some of them reach the stigma and achieve pollination. In most of the water-pollinated species, pollen grains are protected from wetting by a mucilaginous covering. Both wind and water-pollinated flowers are not very colorful and do not produce nectar. What would be the reason for this? Majority of flowering plants use a range of animals as pollinating agents. Bees, butterflies, flies, beetles, wasps, ants, moths, birds, sunbirds and hummingbirds and bats are the common pollinating agents. Figure 2.11b. Among the animals, insects, particularly bees, are the dominant biotic pollinating agents. Even larger animals such as some primates, lemurs, arboreal, tree-dwelling rodents or even reptiles, gecko lizard and garden lizard have also been reported as pollinators in some species. Often flowers of animal pollinated plants are specifically adapted for a particular species of animal. Majority of insect pollinated flowers are large, colorful, fragrant and rich in nectar. When the flowers are small, a number of flowers are clustered into an inflorescence to make them conspicuous. Animals are attracted to flowers by color and or fragrance. The flowers pollinated by flies and beetles secrete fall odors to attract these animals. To sustain animal visits, the flowers have to provide rewards to the animals. Nectar and pollen grains are the usual floral rewards. For harvesting the reward from the flower, the animal visitor comes in contact with the anthers and the stigma. The body of the animal gets a coating of pollen grains, which are generally sticky in animal pollinated flowers. When the animal carrying pollen on its body comes in contact with the stigma, it brings about pollination. In some species, floral rewards are in providing safe places to lay eggs. An example is that of the tallest flower of Amorphophallus. The flower itself is about 6 feet in height. A similar relationship exists between a species of moth and the plant yucca, where both a species, moth and the plant, cannot complete their life cycles without each other. The moth deposits its eggs in the locule of the ovary and the flower in turn gets pollinated by the moth. The larvae of the moth come out of the eggs as the seeds start developing. Why don't you observe some flowers of the flowering plants or any other available to you? Cucumber, mango, peepal, coriander, papaya, onion, lobia, cotton, tobacco, rose, lemon, eucalyptus, banana. Try to find out which animals visit them and whether they could be pollinators. You will have to patiently observe the flowers over a few days and at different times of the day. You could also try to see whether there is any correlation in the characteristics of a flower to the animal that visits it. Carefully observe if any of the visitors come in contact with the anther and the stigma, as only such visitors can bring about pollination. Many insects may consume pollen or the nectar without bringing about pollination. Such floral visitors are referred to as pollen nectar robbers. You may or may not be able to identify the pollinators, but you will surely enjoy your efforts. Thank you.